Free performance. Have you ever wanted to get more frames per second, increased visual quality, better render times, or even just play the game all of your friends are? But the problem is, your graphics card can't keep up. It's slow, it's stuttery, it bounces around like you're mousing your way through a soggy sponge.
Oh, look at that. That is absolutely horrible.
You could spend hundreds of dollars on a new card, or you could overclock, which is completely free, unlocking the full potential of your GPU. In fact, it can even save you money, depending on how you do it. But what is overclocking? What is actually going on under the hood for each of these methods? Because there are 3 ways to overclock an Nvidia GPU. 3.5 to overclock for AMD, and 2 ways for Intel. And depending on which option you go for, it can take anywhere from about 5 seconds for a 5% noob boost to about 20 minutes for the pros, with a wild range of outcomes, depending on which option you go for. Well, we're going to cover the 7 distinctly different ways you can overclock your Nvidia, AMD, or Intel GPU, from easy to pro. We're going to discuss what's actually changing and how that impacts performance, the risks, the benefits of each way, and if free performance is worth these trade-offs. Let me explain. Are you tired of overpaying for your favorite games and essential software? Then you need to check out Whokeys.com. In fact, let me show you the benefits and how you could save. There's over 100 games for you to browse for cheap. You can save every month on your Office subscription, even fixing the Windows watermark, ruining your game capture, and limiting your Windows customization. So let's get a Windows key. I especially like that you can use PayPal for easy, secure checkout, and using coupon code TL25 gets you 25% off these already low prices. All you need to do is paste your key to become fully activated. And TechLens subscribers like the fast key delivery and peace of mind that I use the service personally. So what are you waiting for? Start saving money and visit the Whokeys sponsor link below. Luna, hey, you're cute. Is overclocking fundamentally safe? And what factors contribute to overclocking? Great places to start before we take a look at the pros and cons of each unique method. But first, we need to quickly make sure that everybody has a good understanding of what overclocking is and what aspects affect performance. Overclocking, in the context of a graphics card, is the process of boosting performance by increasing a clock speed beyond what was set by the manufacturer, typically a GPU core or the memory. The reason this works is because clock speed is directly linked to how fast they can process information. So if you can increase it, you will see several benefits, including higher average and minimum frame rates, which improve the smoothness of gameplay, and even lower latency in-game, giving you a tactical advantage. There is an exception to this rule that we will cover in a bit, but typically to make anything go faster, you're going to need more energy. Want to go faster in your car? Put your foot down on the accelerator and off you go. But yes, you are using more fuel. In the context of a GPU, faster is the clock speed and the fuel is electricity. But that's not the only similarity GPUs have to cars. Let's talk risk of overclocking. If you get into your car and put your foot down on the accelerator, what's going to happen if your car isn't in gear? The engine is just going to rev up and hit the limiter. That's the same for a GPU. It's going to trigger inbuilt protections. The only difference is that your graphics card is just going to abort what it's doing. You'll see a blue screen, a black screen, or it will just quit the application. So provided that there's nothing wrong with the protections inside your card, overclocking is completely safe. I've overclocked more cards than most and have never had a card die through overclocking. And if you're particularly worried about issues, most of the ways that I'm going to show you will never ever get to that limit and are provided by the manufacturer. Great, so no issues from most of the ways that we will overclock today. And even the pro ways will kick in protections. But what about the future? You really don't want the card to be fine just to break a day or two outside a warranty. However, the reality is that the death of a GPU is most likely going to come from cracking solder joints, the material that connects all of the components to the board. Keeping temps low does help this, but it's a byproduct of just using the card, like wearing out your tires while driving. So to increase clock speed, you're going to need more power to the card. That's a great general rule of any type of overclocking, but there is one exception that we can't talk about without understanding the bond between the card and the software that drives it. Modern graphics cards are much smarter than they once were. They're consistently checking things like how much power is available and how much thermal headroom there is. Based off those factors, your GPU is already dynamically adjusting itself to get you a performance boost. You can see this if you compare your clock speed while gaming to that on the manufacturer's website. Yours will likely be higher, unless 1, it's starved of power, or 2, it is running too hot. This means that your card is technically already overclocking itself within certain parameters. So you overclocking the card is stupid then, as they already overclock themselves? Well, no. Overclocking yourself can get you even more performance. This is because you can specifically tune for your card. The thing you have to remember is the size of the components that we're talking about and the tolerances in manufacturing. Take this 4070 Ti for example. We're not talking about this beefy chunky boy thing. This is not what we're talking about. We're talking about the 300mm square core with over 35 billion transistors inside. Just think about that for a second. In fact, pinch your fingers and thumb like this and create a tiny gap. That's probably about a millimeter squared, and this GPU fits 120 million transistors within that tiny space, all switching on and off to generate your frames. If some of those can't keep up, the whole system collapses. So it's extremely important to these brands that every card they ship isn't being pushed beyond its limits or too close to that limit. So the inbuilt software that controls the boosting of these cards is inherently going to err on the side of caution, which is good news for overclocking, as there's nearly always some extra performance to claim. How much performance? Well, with all other things equal, that depends on manufacturing tolerances, or how accurate the machine was when it made your chip, and which of these 7 different types of overclocking you are doing. Now that you have a good understanding of overclocking and how your card is already doing it through GPU boosting, let's take a look at the 7 different ways you can overclock your graphics card, what they're doing, and the pros and cons of each. Starting with the easiest way to get a free boost to your performance, auto overclocking buttons. These can be found by following these steps for Nvidia and these for AMD. No auto overclockers available for Intel. All of these buttons you see here are the easiest and safest ways to overclock, for those of you that want minimal effort, free boost to your performance. But what are they doing and what are the drawbacks? Because they all do slightly different things. AMD is lightning quick and Nvidia is more holistic. Why is that? Well, for AMD, overclock is going to give you an increase to your clock speed of the GPU, which is responsible for all computation, and more often than not, is the most important factor of an overclock. It takes about 5 seconds to do a quick check, and gave this card a 9% boost to my clock speed in Fairmark. Overclock VRAM is going to increase the speed of your memory within the graphics card, which holds all of the game assets and data ready for the GPU core to process. The faster the memory, the quicker the GPU can get to what it needs, giving this card a boost to my memory speed. And then Undervolt GPU, which you remember when I said overclocking typically requires more power with an exception? This is that exception, and the reason you needed to understand GPU boosting before we got here. Undervolting is particularly interesting, as it unintuitively reduces power to the GPU to make it faster? Yeah, actually. As we mentioned before, modern GPUs are algorithm driven. They calculate how fast they should run based on a few factors. Overclocking doesn't override this. It works in conjunction with it. So by undervolting the GPU, you're not necessarily telling it to run slower, you're telling it to use less power, which often results in more performance. The exact inner workings of how performance is calculated are very much trade secrets for Nvidia, AMD, and Intel, but at a high level, by undervolting, you're lowering how much power is used to achieve a certain speed, which gives you more power headroom to play with and lowers thermals, both major factors to the card calculating how fast it should run. But it's important to note a couple things. You can't just stack these options for AMD. You have to choose one of those 3, unless you manually overclock, which we will cover in a bit. Nvidia, on the other hand, seems to do a calculation of all three. For this 4070 Ti, for example, enabling automatic tuning increased our clock speed by about 5%, increased the memory speed by about 1%, and reduced the power ever so slightly. I like that this is a more fully featured approach, but it does take an unreasonably long time to complete. As in, I was able to manually overclock the card to be much faster, getting a much better result, and doing it in less than half the time. But I'll show you the pro ways to overclock in a bit, making these the advantages and disadvantages for the quick and easy overclocking buttons. All of them boost at least one thing that contributes to the performance of a graphics card, with Nvidia being the most well-rounded. But every method, other than undervolting, is going to increase your temps and your fan speed, a byproduct of overclocking. So I'll show you how to monitor that in a bit. Another byproduct of overclocking is increased power draw, giving the Nvidia Auto OC and AMD's Undervolt an advantage, if that's your most important factor. It's also worth mentioning that you likely won't need to do any extensive testing. It is still recommended, and I'll show you how to do that next, but as these are all pre-checked by the manufacturer, they offer the most reassurance in terms of stability. So these can be great options to boost your performance with very minimal effort. But let's see the more advanced overclocking options before you make up your mind. What I like to call pseudo manual overclocking and fully manual. I refer to these slides from Nvidia and Intel as pseudo manual overclocking, as they behave similarly to full manual, but you don't have access to many of the controls you should, to potentially get the most out of your card. Nvidia's sliders are easy. Just set them all to the maximum allowed, upping the restrictive limits of the card, which may sound scary, especially as one of those implies that you might double the voltage to the card, but that's a very poorly labeled UI. What 100% means in this context is 100% of what Nvidia will allow you to add through this method of overclocking, which typically translates to about 2% increase to the voltage. But it is worth remembering that the lower you can get this slider while maintaining the performance you want, the better it will be for power consumption and thermals, giving us a 5% boost to our core clock and no move to our memory, looking like a worse result compared to Nvidia's auto overclocking button. And it's worth mentioning, at this point, none of the ways that we've covered in terms of overclocking so far would likely have caused any issues for you. If you followed the steps, you're probably already seeing a small performance boost of up to about 5%. That's really not that bad for just a few clicks, but that's about the limit of what these simpler ways to overclock will allow you to do. So let's take a look at the more advanced ways, and if they're worth it. The thing that makes these more advanced ways so great is also the same reason why many people shy away from overclocking in the first place. Let's talk stability. Because we have more control over things that make a real difference in overclocking, there's less hand-holding by the software. So you're the one that needs to do the checks and be aware of what to look out for. Issues like crashing, blue screening, rebooting, and artifacting, which is basically the production of visual anomalies, things that were obviously not meant to be there. And if you see any of them while overclocking, there are two things that you need to know. Number one, it is not permanent. These are just a few of the times where this happened to me while making this video, and it's a sign of the card reaching a limitation in one way or another, which is exactly what we're trying to do whilst overclocking. Find the limit and then pull back until it is stable. Making the second thing that you need to know, how to fix it. So let's cover Intel's pseudo manual overclocking before we look at fully manual. See if we can make these cards break a sweat, show you how to fix issues, and see if the process is worth it. From here on out, we're going to need a couple applications if you haven't got them already. Hardware Info 64 for monitoring, and Firmark or Unigen Heaven, which is a great option, as you can either let it run for stability testing or benchmark to test your overclock's performance. Run both of them and navigate to Intel's pseudo manual overclocking sliders right here. The reason I didn't include this pseudo manual overclocking earlier is because Nvidia sliders are basically bulletproof. Nearly nothing you can do here will affect stability, whereas these, well, let me show you. Set the temp limit to max, increase the power limit to max for an overclock, and now it's time to balance the voltage offset and the performance boost sliders. Essentially increase this for more performance and this for more stability. There will be a limit where adding more voltage still isn't stable, so drop the performance a little until it is. You have basically just reached the limit of the card, giving me a boost to my GPU core clock in Firmark. But these are very much rough figures, as they will vary from card to card. Even the exact same card from the exact same manufacturer, two of them will overclock differently based on how accurate the manufacturing was, or otherwise colloquially known as silicon lottery, making these the pros and cons for the pseudo manual sliders. Similarly to the auto buttons, you have the same benefits of increased performance and the same drawbacks of increased thermals, power draw and fan noise, but neither one of these methods has any effect on the GPU's memory clock, which could dramatically hold them back compared to auto OC and manual. Nvidia's pseudo manual sliders offer much better stability compared to Intel's. But the way I see it is Intel's pseudo manual sliders do a better job, purely because they are more similar to fully manual overclocking and allow you to push the card even further. Bringing us to the last way to overclock before we discuss our initial findings. Stuff like, does resolution matter? Which auto overclocker is the closest to what fully manual overclocking can do? Some interesting questions I don't see discussed a lot when it comes to different ways to overclock. But here's something you might not know. Typically, I recommend using MSI Afterburner to manually overclock. It works even if you don't have an MSI card. Nvidia, AMD, and any brand for those manufacturers, MSI Afterburner will work with them. But there is one exception: if you were using an Intel card. There is a more manual overclocking tool made by Shimino, an overclocker at Asus, so if you did want to play with that, I highly recommend checking out Scatterbench's guide. But I'm leaving it out of this video for now, as it's not really the same thing, still missing a lot of control, and information on it is quite scarce. So this is for the Nvidia and AMD users, with the latter having the benefit of being able to do this inside the Adrenaline application too. Very nice. But we will focus on Afterburner, as it is universal. Monitoring and stress testing underway, it is time to manually overclock. If available, max out the temp limit and the power limit, and it's time to find a balance of these three. Similarly to Intel, you want to increase the clocks or the performance until you hit stability issues, then increase the power. These demonstrations aren't really meant to be full tutorials, they're easily a separate video and there are plenty of them out there, but this should help you get an understanding of how to use them and what's happening under the hood, resulting in the biggest increases we have seen so far to our clock speeds. And the great thing about this is you can unlock voltage frequency control to tune even further, or undervolt particularly effectively. It's because of this breadth of control that I consider this method to be fully manual and different to the more locked down pseudo-manual sliders. But with great power comes great thermal responsibility. This is the Firmark run of the 4070 Ti manually overclocked, but with default fan settings. Immediately, it was hitting the thermal limits of the card until I adjusted the fan speed. So especially if you are manually overclocking and trying to push the most out of your card, make sure that you keep an eye on those temps, making these the pros and cons of every single way you can overclock your GPU. The auto overclocking buttons are going to be the easiest for those of you with little to no experience overclocking, but they are also going to be the least optimized because of the lack of control. The pseudo manual sliders can be a good option for Nvidia, especially if speed is a concern, and a great option for Intel. But the lack of memory control could hold them back in a lot of games, making fully manual the most beneficial, but also the most work, needing to test more games and control your temps better, at least if you're trying to get the most out of your card. But let's take a look at some of the data, see if fully manual is worth it, and what questions we can answer with our initial performance runs. I'm going to follow up this video with ranking every way to overclock from best to worst after testing in several games, but we do have some initial results. So what have we learned and what additional questions can we answer? Well, you should have a good understanding of what overclocking is, the different ways you can do this, and what's going on under the hood, as well as undervolting, GPU boosting, their benefits and drawbacks. But what about the impacts of these methods to resolution? Given that your GPU is typically working harder when you increase the pixel count, does overclocking matter more or less for 1080p versus 4K? Well, by the looks of it, it depends on the game and the way you are overclocking. Most games seem to love core clock speed the most, and the percentage of performance gained does mostly increase with resolution, meaning if you are gaming at 1440p or 4K, you'll see a higher percentage uplift from overclocking versus 1080p. It's also worth mentioning that I've found manually overclocking is less likely to be stable at higher resolutions. So start with the highest you can while testing. But what about Nvidia versus AMD in terms of their auto overclocking buttons? Which one is better? Well, I like that Nvidia's does more than just one thing, as many games benefit from increasing the core and the memory clock. But you have to install GeForce Experience, have an account, let it run for 30 minutes to get, well, not a lot, actually. Testing with a few current and previous generation GPUs, you're only going to get a couple % improvement. That's a maximum from Nvidia's auto overclocking, whereas with AMD, a couple % is typically the minimum performance gain. There's no account or additional software required for AMD, and it takes about 5 seconds to get a much bigger improvement with the auto OC presets. Another really good question that further proves this fact is whose auto overclocking tool gets closer to manual overclocking, or closer to the limits of the card. The reason this is a particularly interesting question is that AMD having greater performance uplift from auto OC means one of two things. Either the Nvidia cards that I have tested are better optimized from the factory, and AMD's have more room because they just aren't as well optimized. Or the second one, the converse point, would be that Nvidia's auto overclocker just doesn't do as good a job. Well, I was able to double the performance uplift of the auto OC buttons by manually overclocking AMD, whereas manual OC was more like 5 to 10 times better for Nvidia compared to their auto overclocking button, and I've confirmed similar behavior with 4 different cards. Details of the test bench and hardware will be linked below. So the Nvidia cards do have much more performance to access, but their auto overclocker left a lot on the table, especially in terms of the memory overclock. So is it worth overclocking? And is manual overclocking the right choice? Honestly, I feel like it's a shame to not at least use the auto overclocking functionality from Nvidia and AMD. It's there, it's easy, it's free performance, and there's very little chance of you running into any issues. There's not too many situations in life where you can get more with minimal effort. But if you are willing to invest a bit more time to manually tune your card, it will always be the pro way to get more performance or better power efficiency. But overclocking aside, what are the other differences between GPU manufacturers? Well, you can check out this video, where we investigate the real differences between AMD, Nvidia, and Intel GPUs. We cover gaming, upscaling, and content creation to find out which option is right for you. And you can check that out by clicking here. Otherwise, guys, share, like, subscribe, they are always appreciated, and I hope you have an amazing day.